Good morning from Washington, and good morning from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this policy forum, Sharaa Goes to Washington. I'm Andrew Tabler, the Martin J. Gross Senior Fellow in the Program on Arab Politics here at the Washington Institute, and I also former stints as the White House Syria Director and a Senior Advisor at the U.S. Department of State. And this subject of Ahmed al-Sharaa coming to Washington is one that everyone is watching. It's occurring next Monday on November 10th, where President Trump will host President al-Sharaa for a meeting that will reportedly include Syria's induction into the global coalition to defeat the Islamic State. The summit comes nearly 6 months after they first met in Saudi Arabia, where Trump outlined 5 core principles for ending decades of tension between the two countries. What has Damascus done so far to meet those principles, which focused on central issues such as preventing an ISIS resurgence, normalizing relations with Israel, and resolving internal disputes with Kurdish-dominated Syrian democratic forces? Going forward, what impact might the next meeting have on Washington's remaining sanctions, the U.S. military presence in Syria, and Russia's attempts to retain its influence there? To discuss these questions, the Washington Institute is pleased to announce this forum with a distinguished panel of experts and veteran diplomats. On my left is Ambassador James Jeffrey, the Institute's Philip Salant's Distinguished Fellow and former U.S. Special Representative for Syria, Special Envoy to the Anti-ISIS Coalition, and Ambassador to Iraq, Syria, and Albania. Next down the line is Anna Borchevskaya, the Grinspoon Senior Fellow in the Institute's Diane and Guilford Glazer Foundation Program on Great Power Competition and the Middle East, and author of Putin's War in Syria. Then and on screen from Israel, we have Ambassador Michael Herzog, the Institute's Tisch Distinguished Fellow, former Israeli Ambassador to the United States, and former Chief of Staff to Israel's Minister of Defense. And last but not least, our latest addition here at the Institute, a Senior Fellow in the Institute's Reinhardt Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence, and former Director of Strategy, Plans, and Initiatives in the State Department's Counterterrorism Bureau, Michael Jacobson. Okay, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give brief introductory remarks, and then we'll go into some questions, and then we'll get some questions and answers from the audience. If you would like to ask a question of our panelists during the event, please enter them in the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you are watching this policy forum on our website or YouTube, feel free to email your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Okay, Ambassador Jeffrey, take us away.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Hello, everybody on the panel, and hello, everybody out there. With the ceasefire and some progress towards the 20-point plan on Gaza, Syria remains today the most important issue to get right in the Middle East if we are to consolidate the dramatic, extraordinary victory of Israel, supported by the United States and in various ways and times, Arab states and Turkey, against Iran and its proxy network over the last 2 years. Looking at Syria, the most important issue facing Washington as it talks to the president on Monday, and as it continues its work with the rest of the international community, is moving forward on the unity and stability and economic development of that country. And unity is the most important because it feeds into violence, it feeds into economic uncertainty, and a lack of investor and outside world confidence. Of the issues related to unity, the biggest and most important is that of the Syrian Kurds under the autonomous administration and the Syrian democratic forces in the northeast working with the United States against the Islamic State. Fortunately, the United States has very close relations with both Damascus and with the Kurds in the northeast. So the United States, once again, is going to have to take a key role. What should that role consist of? First of all, The negotiations between the two, which began with a general paper of principles in March, have not gone very far, and there is a deadline of December. There is real concern that that could lead to a breakdown, further tensions, and the role of Turkey, which up until now has played a waiting role, but is very concerned about an autonomous or independent Northeast Syria under a PKK offshoot organization, is also something we have to watch. So the way forward with U.S. help should be, first, the Kurds need to take some initial symbolic steps to indicate they recognize they're part of Syria. They have not done that yet, other than the negotiating meetings with al-Sharaa and his team. That could include putting Syrian government personnel on the crossing points into Iraq and Turkey. That could include some kind of formalization of the current informal oil trade with Damascus from the Northeast, where almost all of the country's oil reserves are. That could include a formal commitment not to export oil out of the country without government permission. There's several other steps that the Kurds could take. Again, they're symbolic. The real work, however, has to be done by the Syrian government, and that includes ensuring that there is local autonomy in cultural issues, including language. That could include local administration and local security, including police control. One model is the Iraqi Constitution. Before people roll their eyes, Iraq, by the standards of American engagement in the Middle East over the last 30 years, is beginning to look like at least half a success. And part of that is the way the Constitution grants not only wide-ranging autonomy to the Kurdistan regional government, which I don't think is in the future for anybody in Iraq, in Syria rather, but rather the considerable autonomy, including election of governors, local budgets, and local police forces throughout all of Iraq's provinces, and anchoring Kurdish as well as Arab in the Constitution. So that's a way forward. We'll see what Washington and Damascus are able to, and commercially are able to do in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador Jeffrey. So while this is a visit to Washington, there's lots of touch points here concerning American allies such as Israel. Ambassador Herzog, please give us your take on this visit and what's at stake. I think you're muted, Ambassador Herzog.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. And when Israel looks at Syria, it sees both opportunities and risks. In terms of opportunities, the biggest opportunity is the fact that both al-Sharaa and Israel regard Iran and the Iranian axis as an enemy. Syria under Assad was a vital link in the Iranian axis, and this is no longer the case. An indirect outcome of Israel turning the tables on Hezbollah and later on Iran. And both Israel and Sharaa would take action to prevent Hezbollah from asserting itself in Syria, or the Iranians smuggling weapons and munitions to Hezbollah in Lebanon through Syria. So this is a very big deal. But there are also risks that the Israelis see in Syria. From the outset, there were concerns and wonders in Israel about al-Sharaa's orientation. Since then, he said a lot of the right things, and he even didn't care about public photos of meetings between Israelis and Syrians, and he is getting close to America, which is good in Israeli eyes. There were also questions about his ability to control things in Syria, but I want to focus on three specific Israeli concerns. The first is the potential militarization of what Israelis call southern Syria, namely from Damascus to the border with Israel. The concern is that hostile elements to Israel will establish themselves in that area and create threats towards the state of Israel. Here, Israelis connect to lessons from October 7th. one of the main lessons was that Israel will no longer tolerate the emergence of threats in its immediate neighborhood. We allowed Hamas to become a monster and it hit us. So no longer, and Israel is nipping threats in their bud across the Middle East, also in Syria. Israel strives to have kind of a demilitarized area from Damascus to the border. There is still the framework of the 1974 disengagement agreement between Israel and Syria following the 1973 war, but that's outdated, and we need a new framework, a new structure. The second big concern for Israel is the regime's attitude towards the Druze community. There is a sense of Israel that his attitude is not that of real inclusion. We've seen what happened a few months ago when violence erupted between first Bedouins and the Druze and then the regime. As you know, there is not a big Druze community in Israel, but very much integrated and influential. They serve in the IDF. They are part of our political system. They've been asserting a lot of pressure on the government to take action when they felt that the brothers across the border were under danger. And this is a very, very big deal here in Israel. At this time, the IDF sent some military signals to al-Sharaa to take it easy and not go further vis-a-vis the Druze community. There's general concern about his attitude towards minorities, but more specifically towards the Druze because of the Druze community in Israel and because the Druze are closest to our border in Jabal Druze. And the third concern in Israeli eyes is the ambitions of Turkey in Syria. Turkey is becoming more and more of a headache for Israelis, especially after the war. There's a feeling that they are moving to fill some of the void left by Iran when Iran and its whole axis was weakened. They are patron of Hamas. And there's general concern about Turkey establishing some kind of a Sunni Islamist axis hostile to Israel with Qatar, and if they assert themselves in Syria as well. But more specifically, the biggest concern is that of Syria establishing air bases of Turkey establishing air bases in Syria. And months ago, when Israel got word that this is their intention, it bombed those air bases in Syria. So what really Israel wants to have is freedom of action against threats in Syria or in Iran. If we have to deal with emerging threats in Iran, we have to fly also through Syria, and that's a very big concern. As you may know, probably know, there have been in recent months negotiations between Israel and Syria through US mediation on some kind of a non-aggression, non-belligerency security deal between the parties. As far as I know, real progress was made, but it got stuck. But I think the potential is there. But for it to happen, it requires an active US role because the US is the only third party that can bridge the gaps between the parties and serve as kind of a guarantor for a security deal between them. And bottom line, as you look at the landscape in the Middle East after the war with Iran, Hezbollah, and everything that happened over the past 2 years, my own thinking is that the more immediate and bigger opportunity to expand the circle of non-belligerency and later on normalization of Israel lies in Syria, more than in Lebanon, more than in Saudi Arabia for now. It lies in Syria, but again, it requires an active US role. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Herzog. Okay, Mike Jacobson.
Thanks, Andrew, and nice to be back here at the Washington Institute. I'm going to focus slightly more narrowly than our first two speakers. I'm going to look primarily at the Syria's inclusion on the state sponsor of terrorism list. The administration hasn't announced yet whether or not it's planning to lift the SST, as it's called, label on Syria as part of this visit. And it's interesting that Syria is actually the lone surviving member from the original SST list back in 1979. Everyone else has come off or been added since, including Iran was not on that initial list, which is interesting. Reading the tea leaves, though, it does seem like they will likely be removed in the near future. First, President Trump has made clear that he is inclined to remove all Syria sanctions. He thinks that's the best chance of success for the new government. The administration has also moved the goalposts slightly in Syria's direction on SST and foreign fighters, making it easier for them to meet the bar that has been set by the administration. I think it would also, as Andrew mentioned, they are supposedly joining the de-ISIS coalition as part of this trip, and it would be, I would say, at the least awkward to have a state sponsor of terrorism as a member of the de-ISIS coalition. I think on its face, you can make a credible case for removal. The statutes governing state sponsor of terrorism are very flexible. It says something like repeatedly provided support for international terrorism, something along those lines, and the Secretary of State has broad discretion to put on or remove countries from that list. And you see countries that have been added, taken off, put back on, taken back off. So it is not a difficult thing to do. On the substance, we've also agreed formally that HTS, which Sharaa led, has been disbanded and taken them off the foreign terrorist organization list. And Syria has made some real progress on counterterrorism over the past year, strengthening the case for their removal. They've gone after some of the Palestinian terrorists, arrested them, deported them, cooperated with the U.S. on ISIS, and cracked down, as Ambassador Herzog said, on Iran and Hezbollah's use of Syria. Ideally, though, it would be better to wait because I still think that the terrorism and counterterrorism environment is so fluid with respect to the new government. On foreign fighter issues, which I think is probably the main thing, there still is not great clarity on how they will proceed. They've created a unit in the military to house the foreign fighters, but I think there's a lot left that's still unclear on how this unit will be handled and what their role will be in the government. It's also, there are clear limitations, even if the will is there to counter Iran and Hezbollah's use of Syria, there are clear limitations in their capabilities. And there's still no plan or agreement yet on how to handle the ISIS detention centers or the displaced person camps with ISIS detention centers under the SDF control. There would be some practical impact to lifting the SST sanctions. And interestingly, from a counterterrorism perspective, I think it would make it easier for the U.S. to provide foreign assistance that could be used to bolster their capabilities. So in addition to there being a credible case, that would be a counterterrorism reason to lift the state sponsor of terrorism. Although, as I think we're going to talk later, the Caesar Act is probably the bigger thing that's holding them back right now than the state sponsor of terrorism. There are a few things, and we can talk more about this in the discussion, that this administration could do to maintain leverage over the Sharaa regime if they do lift the sanction, the state sponsor. First, as required in the statute, they have to get robust written assurances from Sharaa's government in terms of their terrorism and counterterrorism commitments, full cooperation on ISIS, transition plan for the displaced, for the detention centers, zero tolerance for the foreign fighters who are in government on the terrorism front, and full cooperation with the U.S. on Iran and Hezbollah. And quickly, they should also use, there's two paths to remove a country from the state sponsor of terrorism list. One is to say that they have not engaged in terrorism over the last 6 months. The second is to make the case that there was a fundamental change in the regime. And I would recommend that they use the first one, the 6-month prong, because of both in terms of the messaging and in the terms of leverage, where there's a number of cases where you operate under the 6-month prong and then can put countries back on. There's never been a case where a country has been removed under the substantial change prong and then added back in. And there are a few other things I think that they could do as leverage as well, but I will stop there.
Great. And just to point out, Mike wrote this all up in a policy watch that was published a few days ago. Mike, is that right?
Seems right.
Yeah, exactly. Anyways, you'll find it on the Washington Institute website. Okay, over to you, Anna.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm going to set the background for how to read the meeting with Sharaa on Monday from Russia's perspective. First, Russia is playing the long game in Syria. And second, there's no indication that Damascus will abandon Russia. So what do I mean by Russia is playing the long game? As everyone here knows, Russia has a long history with Syria. Syria was key to the Soviet Union's position during the Cold War. Russia stayed in Syria after the Cold War, and Putin used Syria as a way to reassert Russia's influence across the region. When Assad fell last December, Russia was only halfway out of Syria's door. And Moscow has used the past year to consolidate influence. Change in Syria's leadership, though certainly was a significant blow to Russia, but it was not the fundamental game changer for the relationship between Russia and Syria that many talked about at the time. And how do we know that? Well, first, because Russia retains its military bases in Syria. It's highly unusual for a country where you had a great power backing a ruling regime, having the opposition oust that regime, and yet having that same great power retain military bases there. We certainly didn't have that luxury in South Vietnam. Syria is going to have a hard time weaning itself off of its long-standing military relationship with Russia in the absence of other alternatives. Russia is continuing its economic engagement with Syria as a key supplier of Syria's oil, resuming wheat shipments and printing Syria's currency. Russia also retains ties with all actors in Syria, as well as external actors playing a role in Syria. So be that Damascus, the SDF, Christians or Alawites, Turkey and Israel, who find themselves at odds in Syria. So this is what I mean by a long game. Certainly, Russia is not a priority in Syria now. It is not in the forefront, but it's taking this backseat with an intended purpose. What do I mean by there's no indication that Damascus will abandon Russia? First, Sharaa himself, throughout the past year, talked about Russia's strategic relationship with Syria. He gave no indication that he's going to break relations with Russia. Second, if we look at the last month, Russia was about to host an Arab summit in Moscow and ended up having to cancel it because of the US brokered ceasefire on Gaza. But the one Arab leader who did show up was Ahmed al-Sharaa. And upon the conclusion of that meeting, Sharaa reiterated that Russia is going to keep its bases in Syria. Now think about it. Russia helped Assad commit war crimes. Russia is now harboring Assad. This is one war criminal harboring another. And rather than having a discussion about having Russia pay for these war crimes, Russia gets to keep its bases in Syria. Last but not least, Sharaa himself gave an interview several months ago where he indicated that as his forces were advancing on Damascus last December, he made a deal with Moscow, and Russia stayed away from fighting. This helps us understand why Moscow abandoned Assad as quickly as they did, even though theoretically they had the resources to support him, at least in the short term. So all of this brings us to the present and helps us understand how to read the meeting on Monday. Thank you.
Okay. And just to add to that long list you talked about there, Anna, which was quite comprehensive. Also, of course, the Russians spent a number of years bombing the hell out of Sharaa personally in Idlib province, as yes. Ambassador Jeffrey and I and others had to deal with in government over and over and over again. So it is it's quite interesting that the Russians have been able to maintain their foothold in the country. Okay, so thank you very much for your introductory remarks. Let's go on to a couple of rounds of questions, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. If if you would like to ask questions of our panelists during the event, please enter them into the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you are watching this on our website or YouTube, feel free to email your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Ambassador Jeffrey, I'll turn to you first to set the table. You mentioned that the Shara's government's respect for local governments, security, cultural rights, as you put it, is key. But minorities in Syria, particularly those with weapons, such as the Druze in southern Syria and the Kurds in northeast Syria, say they need guarantees that the sectarian conflict that has occurred on the Syrian coast last spring and in Suwaida last summer does not happen again. How can al-Sharaa, at this point, given everything that's happened, thread this needle and get minorities to play ball with his new government?
Not easily, first of all, because there has been violence against both the Druze in the south and the Alawites along the coast. Complicated background to both, but nonetheless, there's reason to be concerned. The problem is guarantees per se are not going to get us very far. There's some skepticism in my own mind from dealing at least with the Kurds as to whether there's any degree of guarantee that we get them to voluntarily do what I think they need to do, because it's an almost impossible situation. What we have seen is, one, there hasn't been a repetition either along the coast or in the south. That's a good sign. There have been efforts, inadequate, but still, compared to the Assad we knew and the Saddam we knew and a lot of other leaders in the Middle East, there have been efforts to try to investigate this, to put at least some low-level people involved in it in jail and that sort of thing. And that's about as good as it gets. But the main guarantor of all of this is not al-Sharaa. It's the international community led by the United States. If it stays united, and up to now, fortunately, it's been united, and it makes clear to all sides that unity and nonviolence are the two pillars of working with everybody. I underline everybody in Syria. I think that we can see some progress.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And Ambassador Herzog, in Israel, you mentioned for an agreement to materialize, I'm paraphrasing here, it has to address Israel's main concerns, and you described it as the potential militarization of southern Syria with hostile elements basing themselves there, the threats to the Druze community, and Turkey's plans to establish military presence in Syria and dominate the Syrian scene and develop sort of Islamist axis. This sounds like a lot to deal with in one agreement. How could this work from Israel's standpoint?
So yes, this is a full plate to address in a security arrangement between Israel and Syria. But I do believe that there is common interest in fixing that, in reaching some kind of non-aggression deal between the parties. I think we have, as I mentioned, converging interests as relates to Iran and the Iranian axis, and that provides a good platform for cooperation. And as I mentioned, the US is a key actor here, and it could bridge the gaps between the parties and basically provide the guarantees. And, you know, the US brokered a lot of deals between Israel and its neighbors, security or political deals. And I want to give you one example in which I was personally involved as ambassador, and that is the ceasefire deal with Lebanon last November after the war with Hezbollah. And basically, what Israel was looking in such an arrangement, it's not non-belligerency, it's a ceasefire, but still, was first to agree on the contours of the security arrangement. Second, to know that there is a partner on the other side that we can implement the deal with. And third, to the extent that that partner is unwilling or incapable, Israel retains its freedom of action against threats. And that was achieved through side understandings with the government of the United States. And it's been implemented in Lebanon. I don't know how long it will hold, but that's a model that I think Israelis would like to apply in Syria as well. Israelis are not certain to what extent Sharaa can deliver. But even if we agree on the deal, it's important to Israelis to know that they can maintain that freedom of action. And in my view, only the US can guarantee that. And the same goes for bridging the gaps between Israel and Turkey and making sure that these two regional powers which both of them are close to the United States, will not conflict.
Right. Great. Thank you very much. Mike, in reference to your excellent policy watch, you wrote that there are multiple ways that the administration could lift the SST while retaining leverage going forward. Can you explain a little bit? What examples from other countries can we point to as case studies or a glide path for the situation we have in front of us?
Well, as I mentioned, the SST statutes are very, very flexible, and it is pretty easy for the secretary to look at a body of evidence and take off, put on. We saw Iraq many years ago, put on the list, taken off, put back on. Cuba and North Korea were both taken off the list and put back on. So there's a lot of flexibility. One interesting thing about the path that I was recommending, the 6-month review, is the substantial change prong would mean that they are lifted. If the president does that, then they are lifted immediately. The other prong would give Congress 45 days to weigh in. And as we've seen with some of the Caesar Act deliberations on the Hill, there are ways that Congress can actually put things in legislation, including the NDAA, that would actually require some measure of accountability from the administration. So if the assurances are in place, you could actually have requirements for the administration to provide detailed updates for Congress on how Syria is doing it, and there'd be some measure of public accountability for that. There's also another tool called the Not Fully Cooperating Country List. I don't know who came up with that catchy name, and that's relating to counterterrorism specifically. And interestingly, the day before President Trump met with al-Sharaa for the first time was the day that the administration announced that Syria was being included this year again on what's called the NFCC list. So that will come up for review again in the spring of 2026. Statutorily, it's in May, and that will be another thing that the administration can use to basically point to the Syrian government, say, look, we're going to keep you included on this list, which has some restrictions on dealing with the Syrian government if they are on the list, and that could be used again as another point of leverage.
Right, and Mike there was referencing in terms of the Caesar deliberations, the Graham Van Hollen rider or addition to the NDAA from the Senate side, which is currently under conference with the House of Representatives, which would have every 6 months a report that would give the sense of Congress on how the al-Sharaa government is responding to the 5 points that President Trump spoke with Mr. al-Sharaa about last May in their first meeting. That's not final text. There's a lot of deliberations to go on, but it's in there, and we'll have to see what comes out the other side. Anna, do you think this meeting indicates a weakening in the long-standing relationship between Syria and Russia? And what do you think it says about Russia's influence in Syria? Is it waning?
The short answer is no. I don't believe Russia's influence is being affected here in the long term. In fact, I think it's potentially poised for a resurgence. And here's why. Don't think that Putin is worried that Sharaa is having this meeting on Monday. He still sees Syria, along with the Middle East, as an arena of confrontation with the United States. And remember, his bigger goal is a different world order. That's what Syria was about for Putin to begin with. It was certainly never about Assad, and it was never even about Syria. By extension, the Middle East is part of this bigger game that Putin is playing. I think this question, Andrew, is really what is our role in Syria? What are we going to do? What are our expectations? What is realistically achievable and what is realistically not achievable as a result of this meeting? What is the downside from Sharaa's perspective of having Russia in Syria? The 5 points that you went over do not include expulsion of Russia from Syria. And certainly Sharaa, for his part, is pursuing a more pro-Western orientation. He is even pursuing closer ties to Ukraine, which is a good thing. But that doesn't change the fact that Russia is still in Syria, and there's no indication that they're worried. I also want to go back to Ambassador Jaffrey's earlier point about how important it is to get Syria right. If we take a step back and think of all the points that everybody here, all of my colleagues have outlined on this panel about how much is at stake, how much can go wrong. Think about it from a bigger picture perspective. Russia is taking a back seat right now, and they're confident in the fact that we will have a short attention span, that we're not focusing on the right priorities, and that over time, there's simply no downside for Russia to have a relationship with Syria. So, you know, and let me say this as a mother, as a parent, I have two children, as everybody here knows. Russia is a confident parent, and they're not worried, I think, that we will steal their child.
Okay, wow, that's a great analogy there. Just for reference to everyone, thank you, Anna. In terms of, because we're all about what people are for here and not against, and making things up. The 5 points that are on the table, which Russia is not, as Anna pointed out, is 1, signing on to the Abraham Accords with Israel; 2, telling foreign terrorists to leave Syria; 3, deporting Palestinian terrorist groups; 4, helping the United States prevent an ISIS resurgence in the country; and 5, assuming responsibility for the detention center facilities holding ISIS fighters, supporters, and family members in northeast Syria. And we'll be discussing that a little bit later. Some of the other measures that have been raised with Syria over time, including the fate of missing Americans such as Austin Tice, chemical weapons, which is an ongoing important file, and countering IRGC, Rev Guard Corps, have been relegated to other channels, but we'll get to that in a bit. We're going to go to the second round of questions, and then we're going to go to the audience. For those of you that are watching, again, if you would like to ask questions of our panelists during the event, please enter them in the Zoom Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And if you're watching from the website or YouTube, please feel free to email your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Okay, Ambassador Jeffrey, we sort of talked about this earlier. You mentioned it earlier. You're a big advocate of international unity, using this external pressure, diplomatic and otherwise, on domestic parties to get them into arrangements that satisfy America's bottom lines and those of its allies. But as we know from elsewhere in the Middle East, local parties get a vote. Can you point to a similar situation where the international pressure has pushed parties into an agreement that solved the complexities for which the Syrian conflict is now famous? What are your case studies for success, and what would be those for failure?
Sure. First of all, this is very hard to do. And I would be the first to acknowledge that because I've been involved in some of it on the ground. But secondly, trying to maintain little statelets in the face of opposition from many directions is also very difficult. The best of many examples of that, of course, is Israel and southern Lebanon after 1982. But to get to a good example, I would say the Kurdistan regional government of northern Iraq. And to get to a bad example, I would say the Mitrovica area of Serbian ethnic citizens inside Kosovo. Why did the first work and the second didn't? Because with the first, there was an overall agreement in the international community, A, that a unified Iraq was important, but B, there had to be significant concessions to the Kurds, both because of what they had done, what had happened to them, and that the whole unity and stability of Iraq would be damaged if that didn't occur. And so far, we've been right after 20 years. Those conditions were not in place. The last thing was there was a revolution in Iraq, even if we were the ones who triggered it. And so you had the deck reshuffled, and the main generator of problems in the past, Saddam and his Ba'athist ilk, were gone. With Mitrovica, you never had a unified international community. Serbia, backed by Russia, has been opposed to the very idea of Kosovo, let alone the integration of the Serbs in the north. And secondly, the old antagonisms and geostrategic situation continued. Now, looking at Syria, I would say it looks more like Iraq because the old totalitarian entity another Ba'ath regime, not of Saddam, but of the Assad family, is gone. And the international community seems to have that same interest, A, in seeing a unified Syria, and B, ensuring that the Kurds in particular, but also the Druze and others are taken care of.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Ambassador Herzog, and again, I'm paraphrasing here, only the US, you said only the US can sort of bridge the existing gaps and alleviate Israel's concerns. Can you explain a bit or in detail about what you mean? Do you mean brokering a deal or being an arbiter? And, you know, is there a similar case to this for Israel that comes to mind where the US has played such a role?
I mean both, and but let me elaborate a little bit. I referred to it somewhat earlier. First, we have to remember that Israel has a very bad experience with the UN and with some other international actors in terms of peacemaking, peace observing, peace enforcement, and so on. We do have a good experience with the US leading the MFO in Sinai between Israel and Egypt. In Lebanon, both the Israeli and the US governments decided to terminate the role of UNIFIL, who has been very unhelpful. Under its very nose, Hezbollah built its military strength against Israel, and we have replaced it with an American-led mechanism in Lebanon. And I think the same could happen in Syria, where, as I said, only the US can bridge the gaps between us and the Syrians and us and the Turks and so on. We've just seen a report that the US will probably establish a military presence south of Damascus and a local air base. And I think that could help also broker a security deal between Israel and Syria, because the very presence of the US there could provide some of the guarantees that Israel seeks. And generally speaking, the fact that al-Sharaa goes to Washington, meets the president, sends a positive signal as far as Israelis are concerned. Israelis much prefer that he will align himself with our allies rather than with our enemies or people who are less friendly to Israel. And I think in practical terms, ultimately, it also helps the parties internally. Once the US is there and provides guarantees and provide all the assurances that the parties require, and I'm very hopeful that through US mediation, we will ultimately reach that security deal before the end of this year or early next year.
Okay, great. Mike, can you comment a bit about how both this visit, as well as some of the things you've discussed, affects the debate on Capitol Hill concerning whether and how to lift Caesar sanctions? I realize the SST and Caesar are two different things, but oftentimes, because the way the president has packaged everything together as a full lifting of sanctions, they're kind of lumped together. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. And I will say at the outset that I think Caesar is actually a much bigger deal than the state sponsor of terrorism in terms of the impact on the Syrian economy. If you look at the Caesar, and basically it's the purpose of it is to go after entities, individuals, companies that would be doing business with Syria, whereas the SST restrictions are much more directly related to Syria itself. So I think lifting Caesar would be a much bigger deal, and you can see in terms of the administration's focus and the amount of attention they're paying to it. Ambassador Barak is spending a lot of time with the Hill on this. I think that I guess it's a matter of whether or not there is the feeling after this visit that the president is moving too fast, and if that kind of generates some momentum on Capitol Hill, that there's not enough leverage being retained, that too many of the restrictions are being lifted at once. But my guess is, given what we've seen over the past year, that the president will probably get what he wants out of Capitol Hill on this. I think there will be something along the lines of what you said on Caesar, where maybe there's a sense of Congress, or maybe the administration is required to issue a report. But I think that they will probably give him what he wants on this. And it's also interesting with a lot of this, there's an interesting bipartisan mix of people that support something like this. There was a statement by Senator Shaheen and Senator Risch supporting lifting of sanctions on Syria. So it's not Democrats just in opposition and Republicans for.
Okay, so just for reference, in terms of, we've seen a lot of action on the sanctions front in terms of lifting, but from the U.S. side of it, have there been any similar situations in the past where it's been as rapidly lifted under such circumstances?
No, I think probably you'd look back at Iraq, and that was a much longer process. I mean, but I think that played out over more time than in terms of like the lifting.
Some people
of
point to Libya as well. Is that a similar case? But the Syrian sanctions are much more complex, right, and thicker.
Yes, I think they're much more comprehensive. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mike. Anna, the U.S. and Russia have coexisted in Syria for about a decade, so to speak, not always peacefully. If Syria and the United States are to be on the path to be allies, perhaps for the first time, right? This is why this visit's actually really important. This is not just about a visit; it's about reorienting what has always been an American adversary, with some small exceptions in the 50s, over to being an ally or a type of ally. How do you see this potential deal affecting Russia's influence or foothold there going forward? As you said, Russia is not, but no signs they're going to leave, right? But could such a deal be cut them down to size, so to speak?
Well, it's a bit hard to see how this deal would cut them down to size, at least at this stage. So for that reason, I think we need to temper our expectations, at least in the short term. It is certainly a shift, as you said, Andrew, that for the first time, the United States and Syria are going to be allies. But there's so many unanswered questions here. What is this going to look like? Is realistically Syria going to play a role in the de-ISIS coalition? How is Russia's relationship going to change if such a deal goes through? And Ambassador Jeffrey talked about the importance of maintaining Syria's unity. There are many questions about what that's going to look like going forward. I think the most important thing for us is to stay engaged in Syria and to prioritize Syria. To ensure that Russia doesn't take advantage of our absence or our waffling. And if we stay the course, if we do prioritize Syria, I think there is potential for Russia's influence to wane. But given so many questions of what the future holds, I'm not optimistic at this.
Yeah, it's an interesting subject because in my own long experience there, and of course, many others at the table here who have had more diplomatic experience than I have. I mean, Syrian negotiating position 101 is we are a country that is in the middle of the Middle East, literally. It's the row house in the middle of the block. And so therefore, we need to have good relations with everybody in order to satisfy and to keep the balance, right? And I think that it draws questions on Russia, as you mentioned, but I think also in terms of what happens with the Islamic Republic of Iran, right? And I think, and so Jim, could you just comment a little bit about how you see this? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the potential of, with a new government in Damascus that's majority Sunni, like representing the country, that it could reorient the country away from Iran and cut it out. But again, the Syrian negotiating position historically has been something more not so clear cut. How do you see it?
I think you put your finger on the thing that really worries me, which is a Russian-Iranian reconstitution. I don't want to dismiss the bases. I wish they would go away, but the Russians had the bases in 1973 when we got Russia to back down in the DEFCON 3 alert, and we basically won Egypt. The bases were there. when we stopped Russia in Afghanistan. The bases were there. When we bombed the hell, along with Israel, out of Iran, Russia is supposedly a limitless ally. But Russia and Iran together turned not just Syria, but much of the Middle East into a, to cite some of my friends, a Star Wars bar level of awful things inflicting on the region. So that's what we have to be very clear about. The cost of having the Russians in there, or the tolerance of it, has to be no playing footsie with Iran in the whole Syrian context. Because if that starts, then I think that will change the generally positive position of, as I understand it, Israel, Turkey, and even to some degree Washington towards these bases. We don't like them. It would be nice if they weren't there, but it's not a big thing. But it will be a very big thing if they realign with Iran.
Sure. And you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Ambassador Jeffrey. For context also, if we take a look at the last year, the 12-day war with Iran did not result in the collapse of the Islamic Republic. And if it did collapse, it would have dealt a very heavy blow to Russia's position in the Middle East. But that did not happen, and that's very important.
Speaking of axes, since we were talking about, it was once called the Shia Crescent, right? Or the Shia axis. Ambassador Herzog, you mentioned something earlier about a new axis coming from Turkey and Israel's concerns about it. And I realize that you have a lot more experience in both in diplomacy and life than I do. But do you see a new kind of axis coming to replace the threats that came from Iran, or is it a whole other thing, a whole other animal, so to speak, to deal with?
It's certainly not equivalent, because the main threat from Iran was the military and terror threat to Israel and to the region, and the stability of the region. And this is something else. This is a more of a political axis, a Sunni Islamist axis, asserting its influence across the Middle East, and inherently hostile to the state of Israel. And that is a concern. But I focused more on the concrete threat of confliction between Israel and Turkey, which I believe both our countries would like to avoid. Turkey under Erdogan is perceived as a hostile actor towards the state of Israel. We now see the Trump administration inviting them to play a role in Gaza, and Israel accepted that. But Israel did veto a military presence of Turkish forces inside Gaza, much the same as it opposes a military presence of Turkey in Syria. And this is something that has to be managed. Today in the Middle East, the more energetic powers are non-Arab powers, Israel and Turkey, and this has to be managed.
Right. Great. Thank you. Okay. Let's turn to the audience then. Again, if you'd like to ask a question, please, if you're watching on Zoom, put it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, or if you're watching this on the website or YouTube, please send your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. In terms of the first question I have is, and of course it's an anticipatory one, what impact will the outcome of the Sharaa visit have on the situation in northeast Syria and the Kurdish people? Jim, I know you have a lot probably to say about that, but I bet some others here do as well.
I think the administration will push to accelerate the, as I said, so far stalled negotiations, and whether it will use real pressure, and it has pressure points with both Sharaa and with the Kurds, including the nature of our support for the Kurds and our nature of support to Sharaa. That's hard to say, because it'll depend on how important this issue is given others, and how the administration comes down on who's, I don't want to say this, but more at fault, or who is sometimes more liable to be pressured. So we'll have to see.
Right, exactly. I think there's a quick follow-up from the same person from the audience, what is the likelihood of war breaking out between the two sides with a possible Turkish military intervention, which has been long speculated, sometimes occurred in 2019 as a result of this agreement?
The integration of Kurds into Turkey is one of the least reported really good stories in the Middle East over the past decade. Turkey would tear that up with tremendous internal impact if it engaged in a major war with the Kurds of northeast Syria. So I think that can be forestalled, but there are other things the Turks can do that will make our presence and make the survival as a quasi-independent entity of the Northeast more difficult. That's what we have to watch out for.
Okay. Here we have a question about concerning energy, which is really important in Syria for a variety of reasons. First, the lack of it during the war, and also the fact that it is this central country and centrally located with all the potential of moving energy one way or the other. As the U.S. Secretary of Energy met with East Med regional ministers of energy in Athens on Thursday, what is the view of the panel of Turkey having started supplying natural gas to Syria several weeks ago? And maybe steps should be taken to foster Israel doing something similar in the provision of gas, which has, of course, been moved in the past through what's called the Arab gas pipeline via Jordan. But who would like to tackle this? How about Ambassador Mike?
I would like to make 2 points regarding that. First, Israel has been working for years on providing energy to Europe through Cyprus and Greece, and this was put on hold during the war, but was recently revived. And Israel's Minister of Energy just mentioned this week that this is back on the table. And given the relations with Turkey, as I explained, I don't think Israel views the option of exporting to Europe through Turkey. But I also want to mention something else. Just before the war that erupted on October 7th, the US led an initiative to open a corridor, an energy, communication, and transportation corridor between Asia and Europe, going through Israel to Europe and through the Gulf to India. It hasn't materialized because of the war, but now we see Turkey with ambitions to compete with that and establish a similar corridor only through Syria to the Gulf and India. And I just want to draw your attention. That's a very interesting development.
Great. This is another one, although I'm trying to. So basically, one of our questioners said, Ambassador Jeffrey, you talked a lot about the need for unity to maintain the integrity of Syria. Ambassador Herzog talked about Israel's looking into southern Syria and its interests there, the Druze community, which also goes on to the other side of the frontier into Israel, which many has indicated that Israel wants a divided Syria. How do we square all of this? Are we talking about the same thing here, or are we talking about two different models going forward from what you're talking about, Ambassador Jeffrey, to what you mentioned, Ambassador Herzog?
I'm a Occam's razor guy. The simplest solution of the simplest answer is usually the best. Nation states are nation states. You get into things on the ground as basic as birth certificates, university diplomas, and pension payments, and you realize it's really, really hard to have separate entities within a nation state. You either have to go to the effort, and I was involved in the Albanian Kosovo effort to break it off, and that was a war and a hell of a lot of other things, and we're still struggling. They're not in the UN yet, almost 30 years later. To do that, or you find a way to accommodate, as we did again with the Kurds in Iraq, local peculiarities and interests and needs with a unified state.
Okay. Ambassador Herzog?
I just want to correct something. It's not Israel's policy to divide Syria. There are some voices in Israel which have been calling for that because of the Druze and the Kurds and so on, but it's not the government's policy. And when we look at the Druze, what Israel is really concerned about is their safety, their well-being, the fact that hostile elements will not come close to them or to the Israeli border. And, I've had some conversation with the spiritual leader of the Jewish community in the state of Israel, Sheikh Muwaffaq Tarif, who is in very close daily contact with his Syrian counterparts. And what he's telling me is that their demands are security. They want to guarantee that they get all the basic humanitarian needs. And there were ideas, by the way, it was part of negotiations between Israel and Syria to allow for humanitarian corridor going from Israel to the Jewish community in Syria. That has not been agreed upon. They want freedom of worship, and they want inclusion in the state of Syria, and they don't feel that they get it. So those are the main points.
Okay, thank you very much. And with that, we are at time. Thank you very much to all of my panelists and all of you that are watching this event. There's going to be a lot discussed over the weekend. We'll have to see what the outcome of the meeting is on this historic meeting on Monday. If you are at all interested in how we got here in terms of the 5 points that President Trump had discussed with Ahmed al-Sharaa, I have a piece coming out later today from the Washington Institute entitled Sharaa, at least the tentative title is Sharaa on Trump's 5 points 6 months on. And I think it's I had a chance to run this by a lot of my colleagues here at the Institute, and I think it's a pretty good summary of where we are, and whatever comes out of the meetings is anybody's guess, but hopefully it's something both good for the Middle East and good for America. So with that, I'd like to conclude and thank you very much.